Hello everyone, Dark of All Trades here. Now, more recently in these videos, I've been focusing on diving into the straight logic of the theist's argument. There really is only so many times I can show you that evolution is happening, or that we have no reason to think something is supernatural, before it just gets tiring. This leads me to what we're going to look at for this one. So today, we're going to check out a channel called Logica Spiritus. For reference, as I'm sure you could have figured out, means logic of the spirit in Latin. Now, I'm not going to talk about the name, because I could do whole videos just on that. So let me distract myself away from that with the video. So what are we checking out today? The video is titled, A Clash of Worldviews bar God, Science, and Atheism. Well, okay, seems pretty straightforward. That is a good sign. Recognizing the clash between the very concept of a capital G God and science is something that I don't often see in theists' videos, and I wonder how he's going to tie atheism into it. But for now, what do you think? Put your guesses in the comments, and we'll get right into this clash of worldviews.
Only heaven silent for an answer.
The total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute it takes me to read this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive, others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear, others are being slowly devoured from within by rasping parasites. Thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. It must be so. If there is ever a time of plenty, this very fact will automatically lead to an increase in population until the natural state of starvation and misery is restored.
Alright, so we open with a vivid catalog of suffering in the natural world. Animals eaten alive, parasites, starvation cycles, fear everywhere. And to be clear, none of that is controversial. Nature is often harsh. Biology isn't a Disney film. But it isn't really an argument yet. It's an emotional framing. It sets the stage before any conclusions are defended. Philosophically, this connects to what is called the problem of natural evil, something I've covered before. The basic tension is straightforward. If there is an all-powerful, all-good designer, why design a system where suffering isn't the exception but the operating principle? And importantly, this isn't about human wrongdoing. Lions aren't sinners. Tapeworms didn't fall from grace. This kind of suffering predates humanity by hundreds of millions of years. Evolution explains this cleanly. Natural selection doesn't care about happiness, fairness, or moral flourishing. It selects traits that reproduce effectively. If pain, predation, and parasitism help genes propagate, those traits persist. No intention is required. No cosmic plan is necessary. In fact, the world being described here, indifferent, often brutal, driven by survival pressures, is pretty much exactly what evolutionary biology predicts. What it doesn't obviously resemble is the product of a benevolent designer who, being omnipotent, had literally infinite alternatives. So as we go forward, here is my approach. I am less interested in the rhetorical atmosphere and more interested in arguments, because emotional imagery can be powerful, but it isn't evidence.
In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference.
Alright. This is classic Dawkins from his 2005 book River Out of Eden, and it's framing a naturalistic picture. Blind forces, genetic replication, no built-in justice system. Fair enough. But before anyone builds a philosophical house on that foundation, we need to tidy up a few definitions. First, atheism isn't naturalism. I am very surprised I have to keep mentioning this. Atheism is simply not being convinced a God exists. That's the whole job description. Some atheists are naturalists, and some aren't, but those are entirely separate philosophical commitments. Second, Science isn't a worldview. Another thing I'm surprised I have to mention as often as I do. Science is a method, a way of testing claims against reality. It tells us how things behave, not what ultimate meaning they must have. Expecting science to deliver cosmic purpose is a bit like expecting a microscope to write poetry. Wrong tool. And here's where the framing sometimes sneaks in a false choice. Either God supplies purpose and justice, or everything is meaningless chaos. But humans generate meaning all the time, through relationships, culture, ethics, creativity. Justice, too, is something societies build, not something hurricanes enforce. Now, Dawkins' descriptive point is actually pretty solid. Nature doesn't appear morally organized. Earthquakes don't spare the virtuous, and viruses don't screen for character references. The universe looks indifferent to human moral categories. But looks different isn't the same as therefore God doesn't exist. And it's definitely not the same as life has no meaning. That extra step requires argument and not atmosphere. So again, interesting framing, but framing isn't proof. And I have a feeling that distinction is going to matter a lot as this discussion unfolds.
This is the first of a planned series of talks on God, science, and atheism. I want to bring some new perspectives on the great God question. Does God exist or not? Is the universe created by a divine being, or is it all simply imagination and there is nothing but matter?
Alright, now we get the mission statement. A series on God, science, and atheism, tackling what he calls the great God question. Totally fair. That is one of humanity's oldest philosophical debates. But again, notice how the options are framed. Either a divine being created the universe, or it's all imagination and nothing but matter. That sounds neat and decisive, but philosophically, once again, it's a false narrowing of the field. Because atheism doesn't claim reality is simply imagination, and it certainly doesn't automatically claim everything is nothing but matter. Atheism at its core is just this. The evidence presented so far hasn't convinced me a God exists. That's a conclusion about one claim, not a complete metaphysical blueprint. And once you zoom out philosophically, the alternatives multiply fast. There are forms of physicalism, sure, but also neuromonism, panpsychism, non-theistic idealism, process philosophy, emergentist theories of mind. Entire libraries of thought that don't involve a creator deity, yet also don't reduce existence to crude materialism. So what's happening here is subtle but important. Narrow the alternatives enough, and one option starts to look like the only sophisticated choice left. There's another assumption tucked in too. That is, if the universe lacks built-in cosmic purpose, then life must be meaningless. But that doesn't follow. Humans generate meaning constantly. Art, relationships, moral systems, intellectual pursuits. Meaning doesn't have to be installed by the manufacturer to be real to the user. And finally, science itself doesn't actually answer, does God exist? Science investigates natural processes. The God question lives mostly in philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of religion. So framing this as a straight science versus atheism versus God showdown risks mixing categories before the conversation even starts. So I'm not objecting to the question. It's a great question. I'm objecting to the framing. Because if we want a serious discussion, the bare minimum is representing each position in its strongest form, not the most rhetorically convenient one. Otherwise, we're not talking about ideas, we're debating caricatures.
It was a picture of the Manhattan skyline with the caption, "Imagine a world without religion." What was the connection? The twin towers of the World Trade Center were conspicuously present.
Alright, now we get this visual rhetorical move. The Manhattan skyline, the twin towers visible, and the caption, "Imagine a world without religion." The implication doesn't exactly whisper. It really shouts. Remove religion, maybe tragedies like 9/11 disappear. But this is where emotional association can outrun careful thinking, because history is rarely monocausal. Events like 9/11 involved religion. Yes, the perpetrators explicitly said so. but also geopolitics, regional conflict, ideology, identity, power struggles. Human violence almost never comes with a single cause label attached. And here's the broader point. Violence isn't uniquely religious. Humans organize around flags, nations, political ideologies, ethnic identities, and conflict follows those lines too. That's not an endorsement of religion. It's a reminder that the constant variable in human conflict is usually humans. At the same time, religion has undeniably motivated positive social action. Abolition movements, humanitarian aid, education, civil rights advocacy. None of that proves religious claims are true, of course. Good consequences don't validate metaphysics. But it does mean the social impact story is complicated. And on the flip side, secular moral motivation is plainly real. Plenty of people dedicate their lives to reducing suffering without invoking divine authority, often grounded in empathy, shared human vulnerability, or philosophical ethics. So again, this feels less like an argument and more like atmosphere. Powerful imagery, strong emotional cues. But if we're interested in understanding religion's actual social effects, we need analysis and not association. Because images can provoke feelings. They don't, by themselves, establish causes.
Here's a statement from Freeman Dyson. Religion has been historically and still is today a cause of great evil as well as great good in human affairs. We have seen terrible wars and terrible persecutions conducted in the name of religion. We have also seen large numbers of people inspired by religion to live lives of heroic virtue, bringing education and medical care to the poor, helping to abolish slavery and spread peace among nations. Compared to the tenor of those tussles or attacks by the anti-theists, earlier in the century there was the new atheism, anti-theism, which was bashing away at religion. Science must destroy religion. But maybe science is overrated.
Alright, quick sourcing note first, because accuracy matters. I tried to find this as a single Freeman Dyson quote, and I couldn't. It looks like a blend of paraphrase, commentary, and possibly partial quotation, so I'm not going to attribute every word to Dyson, as that would be intellectually sloppy. Now, the original claim itself, pretty reasonable, I think. Religion has historically produced both harm and good. That's not a radical observation, it's just history. Religious institutions have fueled wars and persecutions, yes. They've also inspired charity, education, medical work, and social reform. But that actually points to something deeper. Ideologies don't act, people do. Humans interpret belief systems through culture, politics, psychology, and circumstance. The same tradition can motivate compassion in one context and conflict in another. And crucially, social impact and truth claims aren't the same question. Religion motivating good works doesn't prove it's true. Secular ethics motivate plenty of altruism too. Empathy, human rights, philosophy, cooperative social instincts. Conversely, religion being implicated in violence doesn't automatically falsify it either. Different question entirely. Where the argument starts wobbling a bit is the pivot to new atheism bashing religion, and especially the suggestion that science somehow aims to destroy religion. Science doesn't have ambitions. It's a method, not a movement. It investigates how reality behaves. It doesn't issue theological ultimatums. So ironically, the strongest part of this segment is that initial balanced observation. History is complicated. Religion's impact is mixed. Human agency matters. And once you acknowledge that complexity, simplistic culture war narratives, from any side, start looking a lot less persuasive. And honestly, intellectual progress usually begins exactly there, when we stop treating ideas like teams and start treating them like hypotheses. So, editing note, I'm going to cut out some of the video here as there's no point being made, and there isn't even any talking from 3 minutes and 55 seconds to 5 minutes and 17 seconds of his video, with one minor exception. The only legible words that show up on screen are this. I'll leave a link in the description so you all can make sure I'm not doing any dishonest editing. Niels Bohr,
one of the major figures in the emergence of quantum theory, stated that technology has advanced more in the last 30 years than in the previous 2,000. The exponential increase in advancement will only continue. So we cannot deny the achievements of science which have radically changed the world, but whether or not the overall effect is beneficial is highly debatable. The land is polluted. The water is polluted. The air, they're all irrevocably, it seems, contaminated. And now we're busy cluttering up space also.
Alright, this is a familiar move. Science has advanced dramatically, but maybe it's made things worse. Pollution, environmental damage, even junk floating around in orbit. And yes, those are real concerns. But there is a conceptual mix-up happening here that's worth clearing up. Science and technology aren't the same thing. Science is a method for figuring out how reality works. Technology is what humans decide to build with that knowledge. Conflating the two is like blaming physics for traffic accidents. Pollution didn't happen because chemistry exists. It happened because industrial policy, economic incentives, and political decisions prioritize production over environmental impact. That's ethics, economics, governance, human choices, not a failure of scientific inquiry. In fact, science is usually how we discover these problems in the first place. Climate science identifies warming trends. Environmental science detects toxins. Medical science tracks health consequences. Without science, we'd still have the problems, we'd just be unaware of them. And historically, the big picture impact of scientific advancement is pretty clear. Longer life expectancy, lower infant mortality, safer water, better agriculture, modern medicine. That doesn't make every technological development good, obviously not, but the trend towards improved human well-being is hard to dispute. So the real issue isn't whether science is beneficial. It's how societies choose to use what science discovers. Knowledge expands options. Wisdom decides which options to take. And if we're going to assign responsibility, it probably belongs less to the periodic table and more to the boardroom and the ballot box.
We have been raised to implicitly believe that scientific progress is concomitant with the benefit of humanity, that scientific advancement is the key to a better, brighter future for everyone. That life with technology is so much better than it used to be.
This is actually a really important philosophical moment in this discussion, because it moves away from the specific claims about God or religion and into a much broader question. What counts as progress? And how do we measure whether science and technology actually improve human life? That's not a trivial question. Philosophers, historians of science, economists, and ethicists debate it constantly. So it deserves a careful response rather than a reflexive, science good or technology bad. First, there is a historical reason people associate scientific progress with human benefit. Over the past 2 centuries, we've seen dramatic changes that are hard to ignore. Global life expectancy roughly doubled since the 19th century. Child mortality dropped sharply. Extreme poverty by most economic measures declined worldwide. Medical interventions like vaccines, antibiotics, and surgical techniques prevented suffering on a scale previously unimaginable. Those aren't ideological talking points. They're measurable demographic trends. So when people say science has improved life, they're usually pointing to outcomes like health, longevity, food security, communication, and access to information. But, and this is where nuance matters, that doesn't mean progress is automatic, uniform, or purely beneficial. Scientific knowledge is descriptive. It tells us how the world works. Technology is applied. It uses knowledge. Whether the result benefits humanity depends on social, political, economic, and ethical choices. For some examples, nuclear physics produced both power plants and nuclear weapons. Chemistry produced life-saving medicines and devastating pollutants. Digital technology connects people globally while also enabling surveillance, misinformation, and social fragmentation. That's not a contradiction in science itself. It's a reminder that science is an epistemic tool, not a moral agent. It expands capability. What we do with that capability is a human decision. There's also a subtle philosophical assumption embedded in this claim, that earlier eras were somehow simpler or better for human flourishing. That's debatable. Pre-modern life involved far higher disease burden, shorter lifespans, harsher labor, and limited personal autonomy for many groups. Romanticizing the past is psychologically common, but historically complicated. On the environmental side, pollution, climate change, ecological damage, those are serious issues. But ironically, they're also identified primarily through scientific methods. Climate modeling, atmospheric chemistry, epidemiology, ecology, those fields are what allow us to even recognize the problems and quantify them and develop mitigation strategies. Science didn't just contribute to industrialization, it also provides the tools to address its consequences. Another philosophical layer here is what counts as better. There isn't a single metric. Material well-being like health, wealth, and comfort. Psychological well-being like happiness and meaning. Moral progress like rights, equality, and justice. Environmental sustainability, or cultural or spiritual fulfillment. Different people weigh those differently. That's why debates about progress often talk past each other. They're using different yardsticks. And finally, here's a key distinction that often gets blurred. Science versus scientism. Science is a method for investigating reality through evidence, testing, and revision. Scientism is a philosophical claim that science alone answers all meaningful questions. Most scientists reject scientism. Science can tell us how vaccines work, but not whether universal healthcare is morally obligatory. It can model climate change, but policy responses involve ethics, economics, and politics. So, the strongest, most philosophically defensible position isn't science automatically makes everything better, but nor is it science is overrated and harmful. It's something more like scientific knowledge expands human power. Whether that power improves human flourishing depends on values, governance, ethics, and collective decision-making. There is a much more nuanced view than the binary framing that we're given, and it avoids turning science into either a savior or a villain.
By science and technology, there will be more and more amazing things in future. Super enhancing our intelligence by putting chips in our brains, wonderful, and whatever problems we accidentally make by implementing technology can be solved by more research and more technology. Curing all diseases. In the meantime, researching biological warfare to increase the diseases.
This is another moment where the rhetoric leans heavily on emotional framing rather than careful analysis, and it's effective rhetorically because it taps into very real anxieties about technological power. But philosophically, it deserves unpacking. The core idea here seems to be technology creates risks, sometimes severe ones, and the proposed solution often involves more technology, so maybe the whole enterprise is suspect. That's not an irrational concern. In fact, it's a recognized issue in philosophy of science and technology called dual-use risk, knowledge or tools that can be used for both beneficial and harmful purposes. Biotechnology is a classic example. Techniques that enable vaccine development can also enable pathogen research. Genetic engineering can treat disease, but also potentially be misused. Neuroscience research aimed at treating neurological disorders can also enhance cognition in controversial ways. So yes, the concern isn't imaginary, but acknowledging risk doesn't logically entail rejecting scientific advancement altogether. It shifts the discussion towards risk governance, ethics, and oversight rather than abandonment. And historically, humanity hasn't responded to technological risk by abandoning knowledge. Instead, we developed things like ethical frameworks, bioethics, research ethic boards, regulatory institutions like the FDA and international treaties on biological weapons, professional norms within scientific communities, and transparency and peer review mechanisms. Now, none of these are perfect, but they show an adaptive pattern. We refine how we handle knowledge rather than discarding it. The brain chip example is interesting too, because it mixes speculative future tech with present reality. Neural implants already exist. Cochlear implants restore hearing. Deep brain stimulation treats Parkinson's disease and depression. Those aren't dystopian fantasies. They're medical interventions improving quality of life. Enhancement beyond therapy raises deeper ethical questions, but again, that's a governance issue, not necessarily an indictment of science itself. The biological warfare point is probably the strongest emotionally. Research into pathogens can sound alarming, and sometimes it should, but it's also how we do things like develop vaccines and treatments, monitor emerging diseases, prepare public health responses. Pandemic preparedness, for example, depends heavily on precisely the kind of research that also carries theoretical misuse potential. The tension is real, but eliminating the research would increase vulnerability rather than reduce it. There's also a subtle logical move happening here, a slippery slope framing that assumes technological capability inevitably leads to catastrophic misuse. History doesn't support inevitability. Nuclear weapons didn't lead to constant nuclear war. Instead, they triggered deterrence theory, treaties, and ongoing risk management. Again, imperfect, but not inevitable doom. And stepping back philosophically, this raises a deeper point. Science increases power, ethics determines direction. Rejecting science because it can be misused would be like rejecting language because it can spread propaganda. The tool amplifies human intention, it doesn't replace it. That doesn't mean unethical techno-optimism is justified either. Responsible skepticism includes things like anticipating unintended consequences, evaluating cost-benefit realistically, building safeguards before widespread adoption, and maintaining democratic oversight where possible. So the mature position isn't technology will save us or technology will destroy us. It's more like technological process carries both opportunity and risk. The relevant question isn't whether science should continue, but how intelligently and ethically we manage the power it gives us.
I remember as a child that we were told repeatedly that now with the advancement of science at the dawn of the computer age, no one will have to work. And the biggest problem will be what to do with all our leisure time.
Ah yes, the old science will make work obsolete and we'll all lounge around in permanent leisure prophecy. It's a fascinating historical artifact, but let's be clear about what it actually was. That wasn't science speaking, that was futurism, speculation, and a fair bit of cultural optimism. Science tells us how things work. Predictions about economics, labor markets, and social structure? That's sociology, economics, and guesswork layered on top of technological possibility. And history gives us a pretty consistent pattern. New technologies rarely eliminate work outright. They transform it, redistribute it, and often create entirely new industries. The Industrial Revolution didn't end labor, it changed its character. Same with computers, same with automation. In fact, if you look globally, work hasn't disappeared. What changed is things like productivity per worker has increased, certain types of physical labor have decreased, and cognitive and service sector jobs have expanded. So the prediction wasn't wrong because science failed. It was wrong because technological capability doesn't determine social outcomes by itself. Policy, economics, culture, and power structures matter. And this matters philosophically, because there's a subtle rhetorical move happening here, blaming science for unmet utopian expectations that science itself never promised. It's a bit like blaming astronomy because astrology didn't pan out. Science explains what's possible. What we do with those possibilities, that's a human decision and not a scientific one. Anyway, I'll keep digging into these claims piece by piece, but there is a pattern emerging here, conflating science with speculation, technology with destiny, and possibility with inevitability. And those are distinctions worth keeping clear if we want this conversation to stay grounded in reality rather than nostalgia or fear.
What do we mean by theism and atheism? Who is this God who atheists don't believe in? Why I am not an atheist.
And with that teaser, we've reached the end of his video. So now, what was he talking about in this video? What is the clash of worldviews involving science, atheism, and God? In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people get hurt, others get lucky, and there is no rhyme, reason, or justice. In a universe of blind forces, the universe has no design, purpose, or concern, only blind, pitiless indifference. Does God exist, or is the universe purely matter? According to Freeman Dyson, religion has caused both great evil and great good, inspiring virtue, education, medical care, abolition of slavery, and peace. Scientific advancement is the key to a better, brighter future for everyone. Technology has advanced more in the last 30 years than the previous 2,000, and the exponential increase will continue. While science has radically changed the world, its overall effect may not be beneficial. Land, water, air, and space are polluted. People are raised to believe scientific progress automatically benefits humanity and makes life with technology better than it used to be. Technology promises more amazing things in the future, including brain enhancement and curing diseases, but also risks like biological warfare. So it looks like he is so close to moving in the right direction, but something is stopping him. So now, what do you think of his points? Do you think he's setting things up for a good scholarly discussion? Or do you think he might be a bit too wooey for this reality? Let me know in the comments below. Overall, I give Logica Spiritus a 7 facepalmy Mr. Jesuses out of 10. A decent score. I nearly gave him a 6 for a number of reasons, but I just couldn't justify getting that far. He references recognizable thinkers like Dawkins, Dyson, and Bohr, which suggests he has some engagement with established discourse. However, he shows no sourcing context, no citations, and very little analytical follow-through on those quotes. Several claims that would be worth investigating and discussing, like science being overrated, or pollution framing, or speculative tech futures, are presented rhetorically rather than academically, so it's more commentary than scholarship. He is not academically rigorous, but also not egregiously irresponsible either. His whole video's framing leans toward far too broad of generalizations, like atheism being nothing but matter, or science causing pollution, etc. It sets up a somewhat binary worldview contrast without acknowledging the nuance. That said, it does concede religion has both positive and negative historical effects, which suggests at least some attempt at balance. But his points feel selectively framed rather than overtly deceptive. The video may seem better than I give it credit for, but he appears to follow recognizable apologetic structures. Step 1. Highlight suffering, therefore existential discomfort. Step 2. Undermine confidence in science. Step 3. Imply atheism lacks meaning or moral grounding. And Step 4. Promise a better worldview, likely theism. It's rhetorical groundwork and not quite an argument. So the video mainly functions as an introductory tone setter for a worldview discussion, contrasting religion, science, and atheism through rhetorical framing, and also using historical references and cultural commentary rather than sustained argument. It appears to be designed to raise questions and shape audience perspective ahead of deeper claims in later installments. So while not exactly great scholarly material, it isn't the worst by far. Honestly, this is probably the best video I've responded to so far, and if there's any interest, I may cover future videos in the series. That's it for this one. So now, what do you think? Do you think In Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti has a good setup for some great points? Or do you think he tries to make a worldview where there isn't one? Let me know in the comments. Now, if you appreciated the logical breakdown of these points, spiritual or otherwise, show that by hitting that like button. And you can get additional spirit points by hitting that subscribe button if you haven't already to get more of my content delivered directly to your YouTubes. Though, speaking of worldview, I need to give the most glorious of thanks to my patrons, especially Glanimus, Anima, and Sora, who mean the world to me and my channel. But if you would like to be a breathtaking view of a world, you can join them for as low as $1 a month at patreon.com/darkofalltrades. As we reach more milestones in the YouTube sphere, this entire channel has become its own world for myself and all of you. And everyone who likes, subscribes, shares a video, leaves a comment, or just watches a video from start to finish, thank you. It all helps the channel in little ways. And with all of you, even the little ways add up. I cannot thank you enough. So to try, here's a little bonus. In Dungeons & Dragons, and indeed many games where you make a character, you have stats. And generally there's a distinction between intelligence and wisdom. Now without going too deep, I want to talk a little bit about that and how it applies to today's video. So, one of the most important lessons that often gets lost in debates about science, technology, or even philosophy is this. Knowledge alone doesn't make life better. We can discover every law of physics, sequence every gene, or invent every gadget imaginable. But if we don't think carefully about how we use that knowledge, it can make things worse instead of better. Look around. The same advances that let us cure diseases or enhance intelligence also create environmental disasters, surveillance networks, or even weapons capable of destroying millions. The power isn't inherently good. It's neutral. What matters is human choice. Ethics, context, foresight. These are all the levers that determine whether knowledge lifts us up or drags us down. And that's a lesson you can take with you. We often think about intelligence, and in your job, in your relationships, even in the hobbies you pour yourself into, knowing the facts isn't enough. How you apply them, responsibly, thoughtfully, and with awareness of consequences, is what shapes real outcomes. Facts give you tools. Wisdom tells you how to wield them. So the next time you chase the latest breakthrough or master a new skill, ask yourself, am I just learning, or am I learning to use it well? Because the difference is what actually makes life better. Thanks for sticking with me to the end here. I have some more plans to work with other content creators in the works as well. So if you have suggestions on who you'd like to see a Dark of All Trades collab, let me know. Getting the channel out to more content creators will help it grow. And thank you all to all of you who have given suggestions so far. I look forward to working with more and more awesome YouTubers, and thank you all so much for your support on these fun projects. And as always, keep learning.